Good afternoon. This is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and we're going to bring you part 3 of the Civil War and the Abolitionist movement, particularly of those that were involved in New England. So we'll begin with slide 1. And you can see in this episode we'll be talking about John Brown and Charles Blair and also Bronson Alcott. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, John Brown relocated from Torrington, Connecticut. We told you he was born in Torrington, Connecticut, to North Elba, New York. And that's a picture of his farm site, which is now a museum, and you can actually visit there. So now we're getting closer into the, to the Civil War period. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, even though he was living in New York, his major effort was to raise money to purchase weapons so that he could have the South and the slaves uprise against their masters and all the plantations. So in order to do that, he's very familiar with the folks that lived in Concord, Massachusetts. So he went to Concord, Massachusetts in 1859. And he visited this house, and this is where he stayed overnight, at the Nathaniel Hawthorne's house in Concord, Massachusetts. And he's getting ready to give a big presentation, and hopefully all the people from the town of Concord will come there and support his cause. So we'll go to the next slide. And he also visited the Wayside, and we talked about that. That was a large house in Concord, which was the center for the Underground Railroad. And if you recall, it was owned for 2 years by Bronson Alcott, and Louisa May Alcott lived in there when she was only 14 years old. And it was sold also to Nathaniel Hawthorne. And it became a major point in the Underground Railroad where fugitive slaves were moving north so they could get into Canada. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, I was fortunate to get this picture, searching the internet, of the Concord Town Hall. That's what it looked like. And John Brown was there and on May 9th, 1859. And we'll go to the next picture. And at his lecture, these prominent individuals were there. You've got Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and this time Bronson Alcott was definitely interested in attending this meeting. And the whole idea was to get some financial support, some backing or whatever for the cause against slavery. And that's what John Brown was very passionate about. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, after he gave his lecture, he came back and he made a stop at the Collins Company in Collinsville, Connecticut. And I took this picture probably last year, and the building is still there. It was actually a foundry, and they made all kinds of tools, and a lot of it they sold to plantations and farmers in the southern states. So it was quite a prosperous enterprise. Now I'm saying, why did John Brown go to Collinsville? Well, his grandfather actually lived and was born in Collinsville, and that house is still standing today as a museum. So he knew the folks in Collinsville, and he also knew the foundry, and Charles Blair was the owner of the foundry. And he went there for the purpose of, he wanted to get some weapons that he could arm the slaves with down in the plantation, specifically in Virginia. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is the owner, Charles Blair. He's called a master forge master, if you will. And that's one of the pikes. Now that's not the finished pike. It looks kind of unfinished. They really have to do a lot of grinding and to make it actually what the pike looks like. And the pike itself, that's just the head on the pike. It would be attached to probably a 6-foot hardwood shaft. And that's what John Brown was interested in. Something really simple that he could arm as many slaves and create an uprising and all the plantations in Virginia. Now, what happened was he wanted 1,000 pikes, and Charles Blair said, oh yeah, I can make these. Tell me what you want. And he said, well, you know, I always had the idea of a large knife on a long pole, if you will, call it a pike, and this is the simplest way to do that. And he said, oh, well, you know, I can do that. He said it'd be protection for the farmers and whatever out in Kansas and down the south. They could use this for many, many purposes. He said, okay, I can do that. And John Brown said, well, how much are you going to charge? He said, well, I'll charge you $1 a pike, but I need, John Brown said, I need 1,000 of these. He said, okay. So he gave him, about a year ago, he gave him an advance so he could make 500 of these pikes. So, but he originally wanted 1,000, but he said, you know, just enough money to make 500. So Charles Blair, being the businessman as he is, he just made his 500, just put it aside. You know, basically, if hadn't heard from John Brown in a year, if you don't come up with the other $500, I'm just flat not going to make the rest of them. And that's where it was. Now, all of a sudden, he showed up one day a year later, after his visit to Concord, and he said, "Now you know, I really need these." And he said, "Well, I've got the first 500 made," he said, "and but I don't really have time now. There's so much going on in my business, all these farm implements I'm making, everything for all the down south." He said, I just don't have time for that. He said, "But I'll tell you what, I know another forge master in the next town over in Unionville, Connecticut, and maybe he can make the balance of the 500, and then I could ship them to you." Okay, so an agreement was made. So we'll go to the next slide. And in Unionville, Connecticut, which is the next town over, Hart and Son. They were another foundry, and they made a little bit different style. You can see the brown pike there. Top of the pike looks a little bit different. Chauncey Hart, he said, "Fine, I've got plenty of time. I'll make the other 500. So he made the 500, so now we had a total of 1,000. And C. Hart shipped those 500 back to Charles Blair in Collinsville. So now we'll go to the next slide. And now in the Collins Company, I took this picture. This actually came out pretty good. I was standing on a bridge. Came out pretty good. There's the actual foundry, if you will. And I took, there was 1,000 pikes. So Charles Blair put them all together. He put all the heads of the pikes in boxes and the handles in a separate box. And John Brown was going to assemble them wherever. So he said, "Where would you like them shipped?" And John Brown said, "I'd like them shipped to Pennsylvania." Okay, he figured, you know, Pennsylvania is kind of like a good place to halfway point and then go out to maybe Kansas or whatever. So he figured, okay, that's okay. And he said, "Well, how would you like to mark them?" And he said, "Well, we'll just call them hardware and castings." So John Brown was very careful not to say they were weapons or they were to be used for any type of purpose like that. Never said anything. So he made all 1,000. He shipped them off to Pennsylvania in 1859. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, the Brown family, they were all involved in abolitionist movement. And he had actually had 5 sons. And his other son, which is not in this picture here, was involved when John Brown went out to Kansas. We'll be talking a lot about Kansas. And they had a raid on it was a farmhouse out in Kansas where all the individuals were supporters of slavery. And John Brown had his first attack there where they killed 5 of the people in the farmhouse, and one of his sons was killed there. So now he's down to 4 remaining sons, and they were heavily involved in the New England, certainly abolitionist movement. You can see you've got Owen Brown, Oliver Brown, Watson Brown, John Brown Jr. Now, John Brown Jr. didn't want anything to do with it, and ultimately he became an officer in the Union Army. He just wanted nothing to do with this. But the other 3 sons were all involved, and they were all involved in this conspiracy. So we'll go to the next slide. So what happened was, once again, 1,000 pikes were shipped to Pennsylvania. And then they were shipped to this site in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And we call this the John Brown headquarters. It was 5 miles north of Harper's Ferry. And this is where they say it was a very secluded place. And it's called the Kennedy Farm. So we'll go to the next slide. And there's a map here. If you take a look kind of in the center towards the right there, you can see where the Kennedy farm is. And you can see how close it is to Harper's Ferry. Now, Harper's Ferry was an arsenal. And the idea of John Brown, what he wanted to do was capture the arsenal, capture all the weapons in there, hold it for a couple days. He would send some scouts out to various plantations down in Virginia. And then at the right time, he would take all these weapons and especially all these pikes, send them down there and create an uprising of the slaves on the different plantations in Virginia. That was his whole plan. So Harper's Ferry is a very strategic point. It was a federal arsenal, had a lot of arms and weapons there. And at that particular location, it borders 4 different states there. You got Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. It's right on the corner of all 4 of those states. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's a great picture. That shows the picture. You can see it. It's kind of secluded there by all the trees in front. It's the house where they were going to get together, send all the pikes down, get them all assembled, and start their plan for their project. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is an amazing picture here. This is the other side of the house. And what John Brown was he was very good at planning this attack. And he said, well, gee, you know, he had 18 raiders, if you will, 3 of his sons, himself, plus we ended up with, I believe, 13 white abolitionists and 5 blacks were involved. But in order to get him in this house, he didn't want to raise a lot of concerns. So they started in the summertime, maybe one every other day would make their way there at night and get into the house. And another one, so they wouldn't have any, create any controversies with the neighbors. So that's what he did until they got all 18 there. And then he said, well, gee, this isn't really gonna, we've got to have some women there. John Brown's wife wanted no part of it, so she stayed in his house in New York. But his daughter said, definitely I want to get involved in this. I'll come down and help you. And one of his son's wives also decided that she was going to go down. So they had the 2 women down there. And it was a good cover because they were outside hanging the laundry up, you know, occasionally talking to the neighbors, and they would sort of be the lookouts for this group of raiders. If the neighbors would come by, they would keep them talking in the front porch, make a signal, and all the men would go up and hide in the attic. Now, what was amazing about this story is this was done in the early part of the summer, so for 3, almost 4 months, they were secluded in this house. They couldn't go out during the daytime, and they could only go out at night for exercise and for fresh air. And then during the daytime, they would stay with the shades down and in the house, and they would play checkers, play cards, do anything to keep occupied, and also study. They said they studied a lot of military manuals and on tactics and things of that nature. And they also, up in the attic, were assembling all of these 1,000 pikes. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's a picture of the attic. That's what it looked like. As you can imagine that, all these boxes, one a day, coming down from Pennsylvania, which is really right over the border, next state. And they're all assembling them all there during the day. And it was quite an operation. Now, John Brown asked Frederick Douglass, remember we talked about him, where he lived in New Bedford, and he was a great orator throughout New England. He was a fugitive slave, but he stayed in New England. John Brown really wanted Frederick Douglass to come with him on the raid. And Frederick Douglass told him, no chance. He said, this is absolutely going to fail. And I don't want to be involved in this, but I wish you a lot of luck. So he couldn't get Frederick Douglass to participate in this. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's what the farm looks like today. And it's actually a museum of sorts, hidden out there 5 miles north of Harper's Ferry. And so what happened, now we're getting close to the time of the raid. So they sent the two women back north to John Brown's house in New York, and they were ready to advance on Harper's Ferry. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a great picture. So on October 16th, 1859, there's Harper's Ferry. You could see it was quite a essential location there, very strategic spot, and had all the arms and weapons in that arsenal which John Brown wanted. And we'll go to the next slide. And I took this picture when I was down quite a few years ago at Harper's Ferry, up on the side of a hill. And basically, a lot of these buildings, most of the buildings are still there. And that's what it would have looked like in the early days as John Brown and his 18 raiders were descending upon Harper's Ferry. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's a picture of what it looked like. And you can see on the left part of the picture, the building there, that's actually what they call the engine house. And that's an important part of this story. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's what they call the engine house. This picture was taken after the Civil War, and it became quite a place to go. And you can see they called it John Brown's Fort. Now what happened was John Brown had a few of his men were sent out to different plantations to try to get the slaves to uprise. They didn't do it. So that part fell apart. Then the neighbors and the militia around town discovered what was going on after they took the armory and everything and took it with no problems at all. Then they completely surrounded the town of Harper's Ferry. Then the President of the United States got involved because it's uprising, taking arms against the country, United States. So we sent a militia group down there to try to get the folks to surrender. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's the picture today. You can see on the left what it looked like in 1865, and you can see it's completely restored today. If you go down to Harper's Ferry, you can see it. Now, John Brown and two of his sons were surrounded, and they ended up here in the engine house, sort of a defensive position. One of his sons escaped, but two others were in there. So we'll go to the next slide. And you can see this great sketch. The federal troops are storming the engine house. A couple of famous soldiers that were going to be an important part of the Civil War are involved in this. The head of the militia was a lieutenant colonel, young fellow by the name of Robert E. Lee, and he was in charge of the militia. And one of his officers was Jeb Stuart. He was also involved. And they all got together. Of course, back then there was no Union Army or Confederate Army. Back then it was all the Union Army. And so they tried to get them to surrender. They wouldn't do that, so they stormed the engine house. They were given the okay to go ahead and do it and put this uprising, put it to bed. So we'll go to the next slide. And Harper's Raid, October 1859. And just to summarize this here, very important part in American history, abolition movement, and of course all the folks that involved that from New England. The raiders captured the arsenal without resistance. There were 18 raiders, 13 white, 5 black. All the arms and ammunition was seized at the armory. But the problem was the slaves did not rise up to the cause. They had no idea what was going on, and they just they just felt they just wanted. Had no idea what the concept was. No bad communications back then. And once again, the local militia surrounded the raiders. The raid lasted 2 days. They held them off, the Union militia, for 2 days, and of course they were armed with weapons, as well as pikes, and there were certainly 1,000 of those pikes were in this engine house that came from Collinsville, Connecticut. They're all stacked up in the engine house, and 8 of the raiders were killed in here when they stormed the engine house. So we'll go to the next slide. And here's the raider, Owen Brown. He escaped. He never made it into the engine house and just escaped. Oliver Brown, John Brown's son, he was killed. Watson Brown, he when they had the white flag, Jeb Stewart went in with his white flag in the yard right in front of the engine house, and Oliver Brown came out with his white flag. And then Watson Brown said, "We're not gonna surrender." He turned around. He was shot dead, and then they had advanced there. And then when he busted down the door, Oliver Brown was shot and killed, and they captured John Brown. So we'll go to the next slide. Now they had a trial, and this happened really fast. Certainly not in this age it wouldn't happen that fast. Probably 2 months later. He was tried in Charlestown, Virginia, which is right next to Harper's Ferry. You can see this famous painting of John Brown facing the judge at the trial. And he was convicted of treason for taking up arms against the United States government. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is very, very famous painting. It's called John Brown's Last Hour, as they were taking him to the gallows under armed guard coming out of the courthouse. And we'll go to the next slide. And he was hanged for treason December 2nd, 1859. So the middle of October was when the raid was, and December 2nd, he was hanged. And what's interesting, there was a young actor who was actually heard about this and came to witness the hanging, and he was in the group watching all this happen, and his name was John Wilkes Booth. And you can see what he did later. He vowed to get even for this hanging of his of a fellow abolitionist, John Brown. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, the William Bowditch house. Remember we had all those houses at the Underground Railroad, and we showed you all the different houses, specifically in Massachusetts. And I said there was somebody famous hidden in the house during the Underground Railroad days. Well, Owen Brown, he's the one that escaped from Harper's Ferry. Never did get in the engine house, he just escaped. And he made his way north, and he had friends in Brookline, Massachusetts, at the Williams Bowditch House, which is also a site for the Underground Railroad in Massachusetts. So that's where he went, ended up there probably 6 months later in 1860. And they hid him. They hid him from everybody. And it was interesting. I did some research on that, and he was actually never captured. He hid there, I believe, until the Civil War started, and of course then all the activity and all the, everybody was interested in the Civil War and the battles, and all the soldiers from every town getting, essentially enlisting. So he made his way across the United States, ended up in California, and that's where he resided, and that's where he lived out his life. So that's the son of John Brown. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, Bronson Alcott, after John Brown was hanged in 1860, he invited some famous people into this house, Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts. And we'll go to the next slide. Here were her guests. He had a tea in the afternoon at the Orchard House, and he with his daughter, Louisa May Alcott. They invited Mary Brown to this tea. She was the wife of John Brown. And of course, Watson Brown was the one that was holding the white flag at Harper's Ferry and was shot dead. But his wife survived. So Watson Brown's wife was also there for the two of them. They had a tea there at the Orchard House of Bronson Alcott. And we'll go to the next slide. So you can see they were making all the fancy cakes and everything. That's actually the kitchen at the Orchard House. And we'll go to the next slide. And you can imagine what kind of a reception they had. There's their dinner, there's the parlor for John Brown's family. And we'll go to the next slide. And that's basically the story of Harper's Ferry and John Brown. And we're going to touch a little bit here now, Amos Adams Lawrence. And he was a very, very wealthy man in Boston, Massachusetts. He was actually born in Groton, Massachusetts. He was a philanthropist, an abolitionist. He financed John Brown's cause, and he financed the Kansas settlement. So we're going to be talking about that very soon. We'll go to the next slide. And he had this office building in Boston, and that's the actual sign from his office building, New England Emigrant Aid Company. So he financed all over 1,000 families from New England, all the different states of New England. They all went to settle into Kansas, and we'll be talking about that in our next episode. The idea was that before the Civil War, the Union let the states decide if they're going to be free of slavery or a slave state. And in order to make it so that Kansas would become a free state, all the abolitionists from the different states in New England moved actually and settled in Kansas so they could vote. And this is going to be quite a story in our next episode. I couldn't believe that. The folks from all the states moved out of here. They were so interested in the abolitionist cause that they actually already moved out to Kansas, and it was financed by this wealthy man from Boston, Massachusetts. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is where they stayed, the Freetown Hotel. And the idea there was all these families, when they moved from New England out to Kansas, they would put them up in this hotel for a while until they actually could get their own houses in Lawrence, Kansas. So we'll continue with this story and part 4 of the New England involvement in the abolition movement. And it's really quite interesting, and I hope you enjoyed this experience in the history of New England. Once again, it's Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and have a good afternoon.